Hello, welcome in, Gaming Fiend here, and welcome to a new video. This one is beginner tips for every killer. Now, you might know some of these, you might not, but if you're new to killer or new to one of the killers, I'm hoping there's something in this video to help you out. I got stuck with a lot of killers to start with, and I wish some of these tips were given to me when I very first started. I hope this is of some help, and I hope you enjoy the video. Right, first things first. Up first is the poster boy, the one that everybody knows this game for. That's Trapper. Now, Trapper can be a difficult killer to use, I struggle myself, but one of the things you want to be trying to do is setting traps in tight loops. When you come up against more experienced survivors, they're going to be preempting this, so that's not the only thing you're going to have to do, but it is a helpful thing to do to try and close down those tight loops that you might not be able to catch people in. Also, you're going to want to be setting traps in grass and bushes, so you can try and camo them. These catch people off guard. Ideally, traps and bushes that are around loops so that there's more chance of running into them, but anything will do. And also another quick tip, make sure you trap up Killer Shack. Killer Shack is one of the most powerful loops on any map. If you can trap up Killer Shack effectively, and even maybe turn it to your advantage with a basement trap style game, you could be in for a very, very good endgame. Right, up next is Wraith. Wraith is a popular killer amongst new and old players alike because they have a very cool ability that allows them to become nearly invisible by ringing a bell. The very first tip I've got to give you is regarding this bell. When you're around a loop with a survivor, if they're trying to take you from one side to the other, you want to do a dummy bell. If you hold the button, but don't hold it long enough for the actual cloak to take effect, you'll be able to ring the bell but not actually decloak. Sometimes this can throw the survivor off and lead them into your trap. Another tip I've got for Wraith is to run what a lot of people like to call the pallet shredder build. This involves using the purple and green shadow dance add-ons, which increases the speed you break pallets and kick generators at, and if you really want to, you can also supplement this with brutal strength, giving you a further 15% speed on doing that. It's absolutely deadly. Now we have Hillbilly. I struggle like hell with Hillbilly. They're a very strong killer, but I've never been very good with them. However, a couple of tips I have for new players. There is an add-on you can take with Hillbilly called Spiked Boots. This will help massively with turn-in with Hillbilly, which is infamously slow. Another quick tip I've got is remember you don't have to down with the chainsaw. It's very tempting to try and get the one hit down with a chainsaw, but remember if you're in a tight loop, it takes time to rev that chainsaw up. So you're better off sometimes landing the M1 rather than being desperate for the insta-down. Just keep that in mind when you're around loops. And yet another killer I struggle massively with is the Nurse. Now the Nurse is undoubtedly one of the best killers in the game, no questions asked. I struggle like hell, so a couple of tips from me to you to help you. First of all, I was terrible for blinking as soon as I saw somebody. You want to wait to make sure you've got your second charge. That allows you one correction blink if you overshoot or undershoot your initial blink. Wait for the second charge. Also, don't bother to break pallets. I know it's a really, really obvious thing to try and do, maybe even get some extra points, but you've got to bear in mind Nurse's ability allows you to teleport. Don't even bother breaking a pallet, just blink from one side to the other because you can teleport faster than they can vault. Up next is quite a lot of people's favourites, an absolute horror icon. That's Mike Myers. Myers is a fantastic killer, but they are mainly aimed around stealth. So one of the main tips I'll say to you is to get out of tier 1 ASAP. With Myers, you have a tier 1, tier 2 and tier 3 killer ability. Tier 1, you are undetectable, but you have a very, very short lunge and you become quite a liability in the late game. So main tip, get out of tier 1 as fast as you can, unless you're a scratch mirror setup obviously. Number 2, stalk through gaps in windows. When you're at a tight loop, maybe on the swamp for example, you can see gaps through the window that allow you to view them working on a gen. You can be quite well hidden behind these windows, so try and stalk through those if you can. And the final one, if you're trying for the Evil Incarnate achievement, which is an absolute nightmare, or at least it was for me, be sure to land a few hits early game so you don't give the game away. If you're just stalking and not landing any hits, it's so incredibly obvious what your game plan is, and they're just going to hop in a locker to prevent you getting it. I have fallen victim to this many, many times. Up next we have Hag. Honestly, quite an underused killer. They're decent in their own way. I don't prefer them personally, but I know a lot of people that are very good with Hag. Couple of tips with Hag. My main one is to trap on loops to try and tele-hit people. So if you're on a tight loop, Hag is quite a small killer and quite easy to evade if they're good with a loop. So you want to place a trap at one side of a pallet, for example, so that when they run around the loop and get to it, it will allow you to teleport and go for a nice, easy injury. On top of that, you also want to be trying to put your traps in dark areas, so mud, grass, anywhere dark, because your trap is visible on the floor. If you go somewhere like the game, for example, and put the trap on the floor, it's really obvious because of the color contrast, so try and hide them. And my final tip for the Hag is to try and guard your hexes if you're running them. A really popular perk for the Hag is Devour Hope. So if you're trying to get value from Devour Hope, I'd advise you put a trap next to it. That way, if somebody does go near Devour Hope, you can teleport to it and obviously stop them from messing with your hex. Up next is the Doctor. The more I play this game, the less I see this killer, which is really weird because they're incredibly strong. I don't understand it. Main tip for Doctor is to shock on loops. I know that sounds really obvious, but if you're landing those M2s in time, they can't throw the pallet. So if you're on a tight loop, preempt where they're going to run and land the M2. It will stop them from throwing the pallet. It's so strong around loops. Also, Static Blast, which is your main ability. If you can use that central to the map, you cover more of the map area. If you're off to the side, your Static Blast will blast a lot away from the map. So ideally, you want to use it central for more map coverage. And another tip, going back to what I said earlier, shock, shock, shock. Now, the shock ability is very, very strong. On top of being able to stop them throwing pallets, it will also drive them into madness. When they are at full madness, they will need to snap out of it, otherwise they will intermittently scream, giving away their position. So a lot of survivors will continually try to snap out of it. As long as you keep shocking them, they will have to keep snapping out of it, and it wastes time. It keeps them away from generators and keeps them away from healing. Up next is another absolute classic, a long-standing killer in the franchise, a Huntress. Huntress I sometimes have good games with, sometimes have bad, but overall they're a very strong killer. My main point for Huntress is to wind up hatchets near pallets. What I'm trying to say is if you're in a loop with a survivor and they're giving you the runaround, when you get near a pallet, if you think they're going to throw, wind up a hatchet. If they do throw the pallet, you're guaranteed an injury, providing you're accurate. This can be difficult to time right, but providing you do get it right, it's a really, really strong technique. Another one, Darkness Revealed from the Dredge is a great perk for Huntress. You're going to be using lockers anyway for reloading, so providing that you aren't, full of hatchets and you're using the locker to reload, it will give you tons of aura information, because when you've got Darkness Revealed on, auras of survivors within 8 meters of any locker will be revealed, which is really, really good for late game. Up next is probably what's my favourite killer in the game at the minute, Bubba, or Leatherface, depending on what era of the franchise you're from. My first tip, and probably the best tip I'm going to give you for this killer, is Bamboozle and Bubba is a match made in heaven. Bamboozle from the Clown is a fantastic perk. A lot of people automatically assume with Bubba you're going to be using the chainsaw for the down. Bamboozle automatically blocks a window so they can't use it. So if they're trying to run you around a tight loop, Bamboozle shuts that loop and immediately makes them run away. They have no choice. Another tip with Bubba, learn to steer the chainsaw around tight objects. Even if this means going into a kill your friend's lobby, get around a really nice awkward loop and learn how to steer the chainsaw. If you can master how to steer a chainsaw around an awkward loop, you're winning 9 times out of 10. And a final one, be prepared for bait chases. When you come up against a Bubba on Dead by Daylight, a lot of people assume the worst, whether they're going to be a face camper, a basement camper, or whatever, even if you're not necessarily doing that. So if you're up against a good team, you might find yourself in a bait chase where they're going to try and buy as much time as possible whilst people are on the generators. You want to make sure you're patrolling gens and spreading your time evenly. You don't want to be concentrating on one person for too long. If the chase is going on for a bit too long, you want to drop it. Up next is another horror icon, Freddy, or the Nightmares they're called in game. My main tip for Freddy is well-placed dream pallets. Now there's an ability you can swap with Freddy. You can either use dream pallets or dream snares. Dream pallets places a fake pallet on the map. I would advise trying to avoid placing these pallets whilst in chase or whilst people are looking at you, because if they see you place them, they can easily avoid them. But a well-placed dream pallet can catch out a survivor in the end game if they don't know it's there. On the subject of snares, if you place snares around awkward loops, it can really help. As soon as the survivor steps on a snare, they begin to scream, and I believe it slows them down, or at least hinders their ability to loop. So placing snares around awkward loops, if you get stuck in a chase with a survivor, can really, really help shut it down. And another big name from a big franchise, up next is the Pig. Now, I'm not the best Pig player, but I do know some of the techniques some of the good Pig players use. Main tip, if you have the add-on, bring Tampered Timer. It is an absolute menace. It causes a lot of problems. But do bear in mind you only have a limited amount of traps, so don't just be putting them on willy-nilly. You can be strategic about the way you put them on. Another tip, when you're mind gaming against the Pig, it can be tough. The main reason it can be tough is because the Pig's rush ability allows you to sprint towards them and hit them. There is no guarantee you're going to hit them, and you cannot smash through pallets with it, but if you're mind gaming at a loop, keep that in mind, because it is a fast way to get to the survivor. And finally, more of a perk suggestion than an outright killer tip, Save the Best for Last is fantastic on Pig. For those of you that don't know, Save the Best for Last is a fantastic perk that essentially recharges your melee speed double quick. When you get the maximum amount of stacks, number 8, you can essentially hook camp if you really want to, and you're almost guaranteed 2 hits on the same person. It really does speed up that much. And now we have the Clown. The Clown is a killer I don't see a huge amount. They're not non-existent, they definitely are there, but I don't see a huge amount of them. One thing I will say with the Clown, a lot of the game is preempted. Now the Clown has 2 different types of bottles. You have got the Poison Cloud, which slows them down, and you have got the Cloud that is yellow that speeds them up. I would try to preempt people around loops by throwing the Poison Cloud, which is the pink one. That slows them down. It doesn't, however, stop them from throwing pallets, so be careful when you do this. The speed bottles are great, which are the yellow clouds. Be aware though, it doesn't only speed you up. If you throw one of those bottles into the distance and the survivor breathes it in, they will also gain increased speed, so it doesn't just apply to you. And same as I said with the Pig, Save the Best for Last is a fantastic perk for Clown because it massively increases the melee speed. And when you're given the chance to land a hit, if you can do that faster, anything's a win. Up next, we've got one of my original mains. I used to play the Spirit quite a lot. One of my main tips for the Spirit is fake phasing. Now you don't actually need to do anything to do this. In order to fake phase with the Spirit, you literally just need to stand still and it looks like you're engaging in a phase. But critically, you don't have to hit the phase button. So if you're at a loop where a survivor has dropped the pallet and they're trying to dummy you around the other side of the loop, stand still for a little bit. Most of the time, they will double check themselves and run back around to you thinking you're going to teleport to them. It's really, really handy. Another one, be very careful around pallets, especially if you're in phase. If you're phasing, you're not invulnerable to pallets. So if they hear you and they're clever and they time it right, they can stun you out of a phase with a pallet. So just bear that in mind. And now we have, in my opinion, probably the most universally hated killer on this entire game, the Legion. Now they're a fantastic killer, don't get me wrong, but they are very, very annoying. Couple of tips I've got. First one, if it's possible, keep people injured. Even if they're literally just healed, you're going to want to make them mend again. When you hit them with the Frenzy ability with the Legion, it inflicts deep wound. If they don't repair the deep wound before the timer runs out, they will drop immediately. So it's to your advantage if you can keep them all wounded. Another one with the Legion, if you miss hits whilst you're in Frenzy, you will have a recovery period. So don't wildly lunge with the M2 ability. It's not invulnerable. You won't have infinite hits. But if you do land one, it will recharge your Frenzy and you'll be able to go and find somebody else. And now we have the Plague. Although it's absolutely disgusting, the Plague is a fantastic killer. The main tip I've got, and it sounds really obvious, is infect everything. If a survivor touches an object that is infected and they are not infected themselves, they will become infected. Even if this means another survivor teammate joins on a generator, they will also become infected. So if you puke on generators and pallets and anything that survivors interact with, you can infect them that way and really hinder their progress in the game. Another point, if you're at the end game, maybe there's only one survivor left, you've managed to shut the hatch, puke on the gate handles. If they aren't infected and they touch the gate handle, they will immediately become infected. So if you watch on the icon of the survivor and you've puked on both gate handles, providing that the puke is still there and the survivor touches it, they will become infected. So if you're at one and they touch the other one and become infected, you know where they are and that's immediately game over. Up next is the ultimate stealth killer, Ghostface, another horror icon. Now, this is going to sound kind of obvious, but you're going to want to shroud as soon as you can. Don't be super obvious with this, however, because if someone spots you, they can bring you out of your shroud and it will take a little bit of time to recover. So shroud as soon as you can because it gets rid of your terror radius, but don't wander around in the open, and if you hear the noise of you being revealed, try and get to cover immediately. Another tip for Ghostface, if you can, 99 your stalks. What I mean by this is, when you stalk a survivor, you'll see a progress bar around their icon. You want to get that as close to full as possible without being full. That way, the next time you see them, you'll only have to stalk them for a fraction of a second in order to complete the stalk and get the one hit down. And my final tip with Ghostface is, you can peer around corners. This is a pretty obvious tip again, but to anybody who's new, you might not know it. Ghostface has the ability to peer around a corner. The main benefit to this is, only your head is visible, the rest of your body isn't. There is much less of you to be seen. So when you have the ability, peer around a corner rather than standing in the open. And my favourite killer in the game, probably my favourite killer of all time, my original main, my love for Dead by Daylight, the Demogorgon. Although they've been removed from the game, you can still play them. If you are lucky enough to get a code or buy it prior to the license being lost, you have got one of the, in my opinion, best killers in the game, at least for fun. Demogorgon is a fantastic killer. There are some downsides, so here's a couple of tips to help you along the way. Number 1, portals are your main way across the map. You want to try and hide these in grass and bushes if you can, because as soon as you use a portal, it becomes visible to the survivors, and if you haven't hidden it, it's really easy to get rid of. Another tip, dummy shreds around loops. If a survivor is taking you to a loop, they're going to be watching the Demogorgon's face. Soon as you initiate a shred, which is the Demogorgon's M2 ability, the face opens up. If the survivor sees this, they know they've got time to get out of the way. So you want to tap M2 to dummy a shred in order to try and buy yourself some time. Sometimes you can fake out the survivor and get just close enough for a hit. And my final tip with the Demogorgon is my party trick. I like to call it the shred fling. I don't know if there's an official term, but that's what I call it. If you get up on top of a mound, a raised window, anything with any form of height, charge a shred and walk off and fling your shred at the same time, it will launch you forward. It will cover a lot of distance. It's really, really handy for map traversal if you want to get somewhere without using a portal. And next is another favourite of mine, the Oni. The Oni is a really, really strong killer and a really scary one, and in my opinion probably has one of the best moris in the game. It's really brutal. A big tip for the Oni, if you're new to this killer, get used to using high DPI or sensitivity depending on what platform you're on, whether it be PC or console. When you're in Demon Fury, which is the Oni's main ability, it's a really slow turn. If you can speed this up by any means, by getting a flick to the left a little bit faster with a high DPI, I highly advise you do it. A perk suggestion for the Oni, Nurse's Call-In works great. So with the Oni, when you injure somebody, they leave a trail of blood. You get blood orbs, that's how you charge your ability. Nurse's Call-In works really well in synergy with this, because the blood orbs lead you towards the rough area where the survivor is, and Nurse's Call-In, if they're healing, will highlight their aura. It really does work well hand in hand. And the final one for the Oni, survivors will generally try to dodge Oni in Demon Fury on tight loops. Bear in mind, when you're in Demon Fury, you don't have to use the slam. You can just do a quick M1 tap with the one injury. You won't get the insta-down, but rather than trying to land a main hit, you can hit them with the M1 and take the injury and move on. And up next, we have Deathslinger, another absolute nightmare to play against. I'm not too great with Deathslinger. I do manage to get some 4Ks. They're a very good killer in their own right, but I've yet to master them properly. My main tip with Deathslinger is you can hit people through windows. If you're new to the killer, you might not know this. This works especially well around Killer Shack. If you can land a shot on a survivor that is using a wall for cover, even if you only see a fraction of a millimeter of them, drag them towards Killer Shack window, you can hit them through it. You don't need to vault to hit them. That's a really, really good piece of information. Another one, if you're good with the gun from range, if you've come from an FPS-based background, for example, consider using the iridescent coin. Now, the iridescent add-on is rare, it costs a little bit more in terms of blood points, and they're not as common on the blood web, but if you hit them from over a certain distance away with the coin, you will get an instant down, even if they're fully healed. So, if you've got the ability and you can land them, go for long-range hits with that coin, and you'll be getting some easy downs. Another one of my favourite killers, Pyramid Head. Silent Hill is one of my favourite game franchises. I joined this game around the time that Pyramid Head was added. Unfortunately, I can't seem to master this killer, but, you know, they're a great killer in their own right. My main tip for Pyramid Head is to preempt survivor movement around loops. I know this is easier said than done, but Pyramid Head's M2 ability ignores walls. They are so powerful. They're up there in terms of nurse levels of deadliness when it comes to loops. If you can preempt where the survivor's going to go, you can fire that M2 through a wall and get the injury. If you're good at it, it's absolutely deadly. And another kind of obvious tip that you might not know if you're new to the killer, Pyramid Head has the ability to cage survivors rather than just hooking them. If you leave a trail of barbed wire behind you and a survivor steps in it and then you manage to down them, you then have the ability to send them to the cage, but they must be tangled with barbed wire. This is really good for two reasons. One, it saves a lot of time, and two, you don't risk flashlight plays from the other survivors because there's no way of stopping you from caging even if they do get the blind. And here's a fan favourite amongst the DBD community, is Blight. Blight is undoubtedly another fantastic killer, one of the strongest in the game if used correctly. One of the main barriers to Blight is how hard they are to control. Now, it sounds kind of obvious, but when you're playing as Blight, you don't necessarily need to bounce off of the wall and then hit them with one hit. You can chain hits together. So if you're seeing a survivor who's running around a tight loop, don't panic, bounce, and then try and hit them immediately and miss the hit because you're going to lose time. If you can, bounce off of one wall, assess the situation very quickly, and then bounce off of another. You buy yourself enough time to see whether you can run towards them and land the hit. And another one, it's mainly a perk suggestion honestly, but Shadowborn is quite handy for Blight because it slightly increases your field of view, and when you're rushing around at that kind of speed, anything in terms of increase on field of view is a massive, massive bonus. Up next is the killer I'd probably see the least of, honestly, the twins. You very, very rarely see them these days, or at least I do. My main tip for the twins is aimed around Victor. So Victor can be used as an alarm. You might not know this, but when you unleash Victor, you can go back to Charlotte. You don't necessarily have to get Victor kicked in order to reset. So what you can do, if you're clever, is place Victor on a generator that's got a decent amount of progress that you've kicked. Use Victor as an alarm, because when the survivor goes near Victor, you will see a visual indicator on the screen to show you that they're there. Another tip with twins, be careful when you're lunging with Victor. If he gets kicked, all of the time that you've just spent running around with Victor will have been wasted, so you want to try and angle those Victor lunges well if you can. And a final tip, Coup de Grace is a perk that is available with the twins. It's not a massively popular perk, but that can pay off massively if you can work it, so it's worth considering using Coup de Grace with twins if you haven't already. Up next is another great killer, and quite honestly one that should have got their own map. I think it's quite frankly criminal that they didn't. The Trickster. My main tip with the Trickster is to try and get an injury state with knives and then finish them with the M1. This sounds counterproductive, but if a survivor has been absolutely barraged with knives and they take an injury state, they will generally be expecting more knives. But if you close them down with the M1, not only are you able to get the down with the M1, you also keep the remainder of your knives, so you don't necessarily need to reload as fast. Another one for Trickster, if a survivor is in the open, go absolutely hell for leather with knives. It's very, very difficult to dodge them, especially if you've taken ricochet blades. When they're in the open, it's much easier to hit as well. And my final tip with Trickster, if you're using a monitor, you might find that it has a crosshair option. If you've got the option for this, turn it on. It gives you the center point on the screen, and it gives you a reference point to aim with when you're trying to throw those blades. That was how I learnt to play Trickster, and I still use it to this day. And the last of my favourite killers in this game, up next, is the Nemesis. I was so hyped when Nemesis was added to this game. Honestly, I think they've been a fantastic addition, along with the whole Resident Evil franchise in general. My main tip for Nemesis is to get the whip to tier 2 as fast as you can. You don't necessarily have to hit survivors to level up the whip, so if you see any zombies, tentacle whip those too, because as soon as you get to tier 2 with the whip, it immediately gains the ability to break pallets. That way, if you are looping around a survivor around a tight loop and they throw the pallet, you might not necessarily hit the whip on the survivor, but you can break the pallet in the process, so it's worth keeping in mind. And my final tip for Nemesis is try and keep people infected as and where you can. I know this is easier said than done, it's quite a hard thing to achieve, but whilst people are infected, they will take injury from the whip. If they are fully healed and they are not infected, all you will achieve by hitting them with the whip is infecting them to stage 1. As soon as they're at stage 1, they will then take damage from the whip, so the quicker you can get them infected, the more effective that whip becomes. And we have another nightmare who is awful to play against, Pinhead, or the Cenobite. They are a fantastic killer, probably one of the hardest killers to play against purely because of the AFK pressure from the chain hunts. Now, on the subject of the chain hunts, my main tip for the Pinhead, if you find the box, pick it up. It starts the chain hunt immediately. Now, for those of you that don't know, the chain hunt is when random chains spawn across the map and hinder survivors' abilities to work on generators, complete heals, literally any action. That chain hunt is absolutely fantastic, and the only way to stop it is by a survivor finding the box and solving it, which you also receive notification of, so try and start the chain hunts as soon as you can. Another tip, try and chain survivors with an M2 if you're around a tight loop. I ideally like to, when you're casting the M2, try and get the light beam to be right below their feet. That way it's very easy to land the chain. As soon as you chain them, it slows them down and makes their life a lot harder. And also, another quick tip, not a lot of people do it, but it is a thing that can be done. When you're casting your M2, if there's nobody near you, cast it and aim it up into the air. That allows you to see into the distance. If you're somewhere like Coldwind Farm, and it's kind of difficult to see which generators are being worked, and you cast that M2, you can scout out an area right over in the distance that you might not have been able to get to. And yet another killer who's a nightmare to play against, the Artist. One of the newer additions to the game that I've still yet to really figure out how to counter, but they are a very, very good killer. Main tip for the Artist is if you lose a survivor mid-chase, check lockers. When you land the M2 on a survivor and it swarms them with birds, they can instantly get rid of those birds by hopping in a locker. So you'll quite commonly find survivors running quick and quiet and hopping into a locker mid-chase, not only to lose the birds but to lose you, so it's worth checking the lockers when you're in a chase. Another tip with the artist, if you're struggling to find survivors, your M2 can be used to fire birds across the map. I would advise aiming them towards generators. They can be easily dodged, but if you need some intel, you can fire them and they literally cover the entirety of the map, so you know if there's going to be a survivor within that path. And the final one, if you're in a tight loop, place an M2. It doesn't necessarily need to be facing the right way, but if they are using a pallet to juke you around a loop and they walk through that bird, they will become shrouded with birds. So it's worth placing one even if you don't fire it in case they walk at it. Up next is a licensed killer, the Onryo or Sadako. My main tip for Onryo is to teleport and check survivor icons. This sounds like quite a lot to do, but if you can get into the habit of teleporting to a TV and checking the survivor icons, it can be really handy. Because if that TV is within, I think, 12 meters of a survivor, they will gain a stack of condemned. Not only does this get you a stack, but it also lets you know that they are within the vicinity of the TV that you just teleported to, so watch the survivor portraits. Also, when you unmanifest, you are invisible from distance. Use this to traverse the map with stealth. You will need to manifest to hit somebody, but outside of a certain distance, you cannot be seen when you're unmanifested, so use that to your advantage. And up next, I think, is the best original design for a killer that Behaviour have ever come up with, the Dredge. Now, I absolutely hate the night function of the Dredge, but they are a fantastic killer. It's absolutely undeniable. My main tip for the Dredge is to use the Remnant at loops. Your M2 ability allows you to use a Remnant at loops. Now, when you leave the Remnant, you're going to need to walk kind of slowly around the loop, but if the survivor runs back towards the Remnant, you can instantly teleport to it for a nice easy hit. Be wary around pallets though, because they can bait you into teleporting back to the Remnant and then going for an instant stun. Another one with the Dredge is to break lockers on doors if you see them. Now, one of the Dredge's main pulls is the fact that they can teleport to any locker at any given time on a map. However, there is a slight counter to this. If the survivor pulls the lock across on the lockers that only spawns when you're playing against the Dredge, it gives a few seconds delay, so the Dredge can't just pop out and instantly attack. So if you're walking around the map traversing and you happen to notice a locker with the lock pulled across on it, and you think it might be opportune, hit the lock with the M1, break it, that then frees up that locker for the entire rest of the game because they can never relock it again. And up next is the killer I despise the most, which is ironic really, because it comes from the probably favourite franchise that's ever been added to this game for me. That's Wesker from Resident Evil. Now, Wesker is a very, very good killer. They're a nightmare to play against, and they have got huge map coverage. My main tip with Wesker is the bounding hitbox is kind of buggy, so if you think you might be able to land a bound, I'd say go for it, honestly, because I have seen some of those bounds land at some horrifically bad angles, so if you can land one, by all means do it. Also, going back to what I said, they have huge map coverage. Part of the reason for this is their terror radius is absolutely massive. So Wesker has, I believe, the biggest terror radius in the entire game. If you take perks that are affected by the terror radius, that can be massive, absolutely huge advantage for Wesker. So things like Coulrophobia, for example, anyone within your radius struggles to heal. That is a fantastic perk to use with Wesker because of the massive terror radius. And we've made it to the end. Finally, the latest addition to the game and an OG design from Behaviour, the Knight. I don't mind the Knight. I think they've been kind of hit and miss for me, but they're not a bad killer. My main tip with the Knight is to use, it's kind of a dirty one honestly, but to use guards to camp hooks or gens. If you're in a 3-gen situation at the end of a game, you've got a strong team that haven't been narrowed down yet, there's still 4 people, they're working on a generator, you can absolutely use one of your guards to camp a generator, which will reveal the position of the survivor if they get chased, so you know which gen they're heading towards. Kind of a dirty tactic, but it does work, and it's really lifts the pressure in the end game. Another tip for the Knight, and another kind of dirty one, but if you place a guard down and the guard begins to chase a survivor because they're within the radius of that guard, you can choose to follow that guard and chase the survivor too. If the guard manages to land a hit, you can be there for an immediate second hit for a nice and easy down. It doesn't always work, but it can be really effective. And my final tip of the video, and the final tip for this killer, guards can be outrun. Don't rely on the guards too heavily to catch a survivor, because if a survivor is effective, especially if they've got perks like Live, they can outrun a guard. So don't rely on a guard to get you a down. You also want to make sure you're chasing yourself. And that's your lot. That's the end of the video. Thank you very, very much for hanging out. I hope there was something in there to help you out. Failing that, I hope it was just informative or something cool to chill out and do some other stuff with. Thank you so much for hanging out. I appreciate it. If this video helped you out at all, or if you liked it, please drop a like and consider subscribing. We're very, very nearly at 1,000 subscribers. The next big target for me is to hit YouTube Partner, and we are so close, it's unbelievable. Thank you all so much for your support. I appreciate it, and I will catch you on my next stream or next video. Peace out. Much love.